Good evening, everybody. How are we all this evening? Welcome to an event that was actually requested by my regular subscribers. It was suggested that I might like to read children's stories, and that changed somewhat to Grimm's fairy tales. This is not Grimm's fairy tales, of course, as portrayed by Disney. This is not necessarily the originals of those fairy tales. For example, today I am proposing to read Cinderella, and depending upon how things work out, I may well proceed and read something else. Because this is a live stream, I will probably be responding to people in chat at different times, and there may very well be some commentary at the end. I do have some intent, hopefully, to be able to download and extract the audio and possibly present this in a more coherent fashion. For example, right now I am going to say, "Hello, One Weird Error. How are you doing? Glad to see you there." If anybody wants the text of Grimm's Fairy Tales, it's actually available for free on the Gutenberg Free Library. My copy here, rather to my surprise, I found in my own digital library, and to be honest with you, I have absolutely no idea when or where I got it from. Well, we're going to see how I am. This is going to be a slight challenge to my voice. Very glad to see you though, and thanks for helping me set up in Discord. I do appreciate that. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I will begin. The wife of a rich man fell sick, and as she felt that her end was drawing near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be good and pious, and then the good God will always protect you, and I will look down on you from heaven and be near you." Thereupon she closed her eyes and departed. Every day the maiden went out to her mother's grave and wept, and she remained pious and good. When winter came, the snow spread a white sheet over the grave, and by the time the spring sun had drawn it off again, the man had taken another wife. The woman had brought with her into the house 2 daughters, who were beautiful and fair of face, but vile and black of heart. Now began a bad time for the poor stepchild. "Is the stupid goose to eat in the parlour with us?" they said. "He who wants to eat bread must earn it. Out with the kitchen wench." They took her pretty clothes away from her, put an old grey bedgown on her, and gave her wooden shoes. "Just look at the proud princess, how decked out she is," they cried, and laughed, and led her into the kitchen. There she had to do hard work from morning till night. Get up before daybreak, carry water, light fires, and cook and wash. Besides this, the sisters did her every imaginable injury. They mocked her, and emptied her peas and lentils into the ashes, so that she was forced to sit and pick them out again. In the evening, when she had worked till she was weary, she had no bed to go to, but had to sleep by the hearth in the cinders. And as on that account she always looked dusty and dirty, they called her Cinderella. It happened that the father was once going to the fair, and he asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the second. "And you, Cinderella," said he, "what will you have?" "Father, break off for me the first branch which knocks Sorry. Father, break off for me the first branch which knocks against your hat on the way home." So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls and jewels for his 2 stepdaughters. And on his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. Then he broke off the branch and took it with him. When he reached home, he gave his stepdaughters the things which they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the branch from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave, and planted the branch on it, and wept so much that the tears fell down on it and watered it. And it grew, and became a handsome tree. Thrice a day Cinderella went and sat beneath it, and wept and prayed, and a little white bird always came on the tree, and if Cinderella expressed a wish, the bird threw down on her what she had wished for. It happened, however, that the king gave orders for a festival which was to last 3 days, and to which all the beautiful young girls in the country were invited, in order that his son might choose himself a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard that they too were to appear among the number, they were delighted, called Cinderella, and said, "Comb our hair for us, brush our shoes, and fasten our buckles, for we are going to the wedding at the king's palace." Cinderella obeyed, but wept, because she too would have liked to go with them to the dance, and begged her stepmother to allow her to do so. "You go, Cinderella," said she, "covered in dust and dirt as you are, and would go to the festival? You have no clothes and shoes, and yet would dance?" As, however, Cinderella went on asking, the stepmother said at last, "I have emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes for you. If you have picked them out again in 2 hours, you shall go with us." The maiden went through the back door into the garden and called, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at last all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in, and alighted amongst the ashes. And the pigeons nodded with their heads, and began pick, 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 pick. And the rest began also pick, 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 and gathered all the good grains into the dish. Hardly had 1 hour passed before they had finished, and all flew out again. Then the girl took the dish to her stepmother, and was glad, and believed that now she would be allowed to go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no clothes, and you cannot dance. You would only be laughed at." And as Cinderella wept at this, the stepmother said, "If you can pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour, you shall go with us." And she thought to herself that she most certainly cannot do again. When the stepmother had emptied the 2 dishes of lentils amongst the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and cried, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at length all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in, and alighted amongst the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads, and began pick, 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 pick. And the others began also pick, 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 and gathered all the good seeds into the dishes, and before half an hour was over they had already finished, and all flew out again. But the stepmother said, "All this will not help. You cannot go with us, for you have no clothes and cannot dance. We should be ashamed of you." On this she turned her back on Cinderella and hurried away with her 2 proud daughters. As no one was now at home, Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." Then the bird threw a gold and silver dress down to her, and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She put on the dress with all speed and went to the wedding. Her stepsisters and the stepmother, however, did not know her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella, and believed that she was sitting at home in the dirt, picking lentils out of the ashes. The prince approached her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maiden, and never let loose of her hand. And if anyone else came to invite her, he said, "This is my partner." She danced till it was evening, and then she wanted to go home. But the king's son said, "I will go with you and bear you company," for he wished to see to whom the beautiful maiden belonged. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. The king's son waited until her father came, and told him that the unknown maiden had leapt into the pigeon house. The old man thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" And they had to bring him an axe and a pickaxe that he might hew the pigeon house to pieces, but no one was inside it. And when they got home, Cinderella lay in her dirty clothes among the ashes, and a dim little oil lamp was burning on the mantelpiece, for Cinderella had jumped quickly down from the back of the pigeon house, and had run to the little hazel tree, and there she had taken off her beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave, and the bird had taken them away again, and then she had seated herself in the kitchen amongst the ashes in her grey gown. Next day, when the festival began afresh, and her parents and the stepsisters had gone once more, Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." Then the bird threw down a much more beautiful dress than on the preceding day. And when Cinderella appeared at the wedding in this dress, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The king's son had waited until she came, and instantly took her by the hand, and danced with no one but her. When others came and invited her, he said, "This is my partner." When evening came, she wished to leave, and the king's son followed her, and wanted to see into which house she went, but she sprang away from him, and into the garden behind the house. Therein stood a beautiful tall tree, on which hung the most magnificent pears. She clambered so nimbly between the branches like a squirrel that the king's son did not know where she was gone. He waited until her father came and said to him, "The unknown maiden has escaped from me, and I believe she has climbed up the pear tree." The father thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" and had an axe brought and cut the tree down, but no one was on it. And when they got into the kitchen, Cinderella lay there among the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down on the other side of the tree, and taken the beautiful dress to the bird on the little hazel tree, and put on her grey gown. On the third day, when the parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went once more to her mother's grave, and said to the little bird, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." And now the bird threw down to her a dress which was more splendid and magnificent than any she had yet had, and the slippers were golden. And when she went to the festival in the dress, no one knew how to speak for astonishment. The king's son danced with her only, and if anyone invited her to dance, he said, "This is my partner." When evening came, Cinderella wished to leave, and the king's son was anxious to go with her, but she escaped from him so quickly that he could not follow her. The king's son, however, had employed a ruse, and had caused the whole staircase to be smeared with pitch, and there when she ran down had the maiden's had the maiden's left slipper remained stuck. The king's son picked it up, and it was small and dainty and all golden. Next morning he went with it to the father, and said to him, "No one shall be my wife but she whose foot this golden slipper fits." Then were the two sisters glad, for they had pretty feet. The eldest went with the shoe into her room, and wanted to try it on, and her mother stood by. But she could not get her big toe into it, and the shoe was too small for her. Then her mother gave her a knife, and said, "Cut the toe off. When you are queen, you will have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. Then he took her on his horse as his bride, and rode away with her. They were obliged, however, to pass the grave, and there on the hazel tree sat the two pigeons, and cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe, it is too small for her, the true bride waits for you." Then he looked at her foot, and saw how the blood was trickling from it. He turned his horse round, and took the false bride home again, and said she was not the true one, and that the other sister was to put the shoe on. Then this one went into her chamber, and got her toes safely into the shoe, but her heel was too large. So her mother gave her a knife, and said, "Cut a bit off your heel. When you are queen, you will have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut off a bit of her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride, and rode away with her. But when they passed by the hazel tree, the two little pigeons sat on it and cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe, it is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." He looked down at her foot, and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe, and how it had stained her white stocking quite red. Then he turned his horse, and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" "No," said the man. "There is still a little stunted kitchen wench which my late wife left behind her, but she cannot possibly be the bride." The king's son said he was to send her up to him, but the mother answered, "Oh, no, she is much too dirty. She cannot show herself." But he absolutely insisted on it, and Cinderella had to be called. She first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. Then she seated herself on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper, which fitted like a glove. And when she rose up, and the king's son looked at her face, and recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him, and cried, "That is the true bride." The stepmother and the two sisters were horrified, and became pale with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse, and rode away with her. As they passed by the hazel tree, the two white doves cried, turn and peep, no blood is in the shoe. The shoe is not too small for her, the true bride rides with you." And when they had cried that, the two came flying down, and placed themselves on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and remained sitting there. When the wedding with the king's son was to be celebrated, the two false sisters came and wanted to get into favour with Cinderella and share her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to church, the elder was at the right side, and the younger at the left, and the pigeons pecked out one eye from each of them. Afterwards, as they came back, the elder was at the left, and the younger at the right, and then the pigeons pecked out the other eye from each. And thus for their wickedness and falsehood they were punished with blindness all their days. And that is the Cinderella that you won't see Disney filming any time soon. It is... You can, and this is the sort of commentary section before I move on and considering reading something else. You can see certain aspects of the Disney version. You know, the presence of the birds helping her out, for example. I confess, I don't recall if I've actually seen Disney Cinderella, or whether I'm just so used to seeing clips of it that I feel like I've seen the whole thing. In terms of plot, and the differences, there's no fairy godmother, for starters. It is essentially Cinderella's piety and purity and goodness of heart that allows her to do what is essentially magic. Again, you will notice that classically we tend to think of Cinderella wearing glass slippers, and yet this is clearly not the case in this story. In fact, it doesn't say what they're made of. It just says that they were embroidered with silk and silver, so one can safely say they were not made of glass. I'm not actually sure where Disney got the idea from for glass slippers, but it certainly wasn't this version of the story. I'll get to other versions in a moment, or at least one other version. And of course, there is the rather dark and shocking brutality of how the sisters mutilated themselves in order to get the slipper on. And of course their fate at the end is definitely not something that you would ever see being portrayed by any Disney movie. I mean, that would be more like the horror movie version of Cinderella, which actually would be kind of interesting, although I'm not sure I would necessarily dash to see it. The father's role in the story is, how do I put this? Weird. It's never really made clear why he favours his stepdaughters and not his natural-born daughter. Except perhaps that he favoured his new wife, which I note, by the way, that he was remarkably quick to marry. Maybe I'm being overly judgmental there. But he provides absolutely no support, sympathy, backup for her, makes no attempt whatsoever, as far as we can tell, that he doesn't do anything really for Cinderella at all, nothing, apart from giving her a branch. Now, granted, she did ask for that, but that is actually kind of interesting. The fact that Cinderella asked for a branch, the first branch which knocks against your hat on the way home, which introduces the idea that, one, she seems to have had something up her sleeve, and two, that this is where that magical element comes in. Of course, there's also the magic in the fact that she, basically can ask favours of all the birds beneath the sky, which must have been kind of interesting when the first eagle flew through the kitchen window to help her pick peas and lentils out of the ashes. I suppose we can assume that maybe no actual eagles came to do that, but it does say, all you birds beneath the sky, which makes some interesting possibilities. What happens if a stork tried to get in through the kitchen window? So it is actually quite a fascinating story, certainly when comparing with what we're used to seeing from Disney. I'll be honest, one weird error. I knew about the foot mutilation. I didn't know about the blindness either. I don't remember the ending. But here's an interesting thing. Did you notice, or a flamingo, did you notice the end of the story, right? Okay, the primary end of the story is the stepsisters getting their comeuppance. What does it not say about Cinderella and the prince? What do we normally associate with the end of such a fairy tale? Anybody want to hazard a guess? I'll give you a moment while I loosen up my throat. Normally, we are accustomed to thinking, and I'm not sure necessarily with... Bingo! Yes! That's it. There is no, they all lived happily ever after. It's not even implied. The triumph of Cinderella is to get married to the prince. That's it. But the big ending is the blinding of the sisters by the pigeons. Now, I know it's just a fairy tale, and it nonetheless, it's interesting. I find that we go through all this, and yet what it emphasizes is arguably punishment and justice. Oh, and that's one more thing. If you remember, I think it's in Cinderella, or at least in other versions of this, we tend to think of the ugly stepsisters. They weren't ugly. They were called beautiful and fair of face. That's not how, obviously, Disney, or my memory, remembers them. And so it is interesting that part of their punishment wasn't just the blindness, but the mutilation of their beautiful and fair faces. Now, this isn't the first version of Cinderella. This version of the story was published, I think, in 1813. There is, in fact, another version which was published, I think, 115 years earlier, which was the French version, and that has a very different ending, and I may read that at some point. But in that version, the stepsisters beg for Cinderella's forgiveness. They are forgiven, and on the same day that Cinderella gets married, the stepsisters get married to powerful lords as well. And I would have to go and check which version of that is. So the story, wherever it comes from, has certainly changed over time. So it is kind of I did this is the first time I read the whole thing completely through. Well, actually, I speed read it, I suppose, because I tend to speed read. But it is kind of fascinating. Oh, please note, there's no coach. That is actually kind of weird, and I found that little section kind of strange. This was the first night of the festival, right? And it says, she danced until it was evening, and she wanted to go home, but the king's son said, I will go with you and bear you company, for he wished to see... Oh, and here's an interesting one. To whom the beautiful maiden belonged. You definitely wouldn't say that these days, but don't forget, this was the early 19th century, and so to be honest with you, I'd have to go and investigate the social situation back then, but the strong implication is that she is somebody's property, presumably her father's. But this is where it gets interesting. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. And I stumbled when I saw this, because I was like, wait a minute. Where did the pigeon house come from? I don't remember a pigeon house. So instead of a pumpkin being made into a beautiful coach, nope, she jumps into a pigeon house and escapes from it. The other thing too, of course, is that if you remember, I think it's in Cinderella or in other versions of this, the idea was that the not glass slipper was taken around for all the young women to try on. Here, they've actually got it pretty much nailed down. 3 times the suspicion is that this maiden, was Cinderella. As far as I remember, they don't search. They don't search the whole kingdom. They basically go straight to Cinderella's father and essentially say, right, I want your daughters to put the shoe on. So the idea that there is this mystery girl, yes, it still is a bit of a mystery girl, but it's not that much of a mystery, because the prince is pretty darn sure where she lives and who her father is. And of course the king's son knew the house she was in, because, yes, he obviously he had to have followed her. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. Sorry. And so, again, a lot more focused and a lot more deliberate plot than you see from Cinderella. Excuse me a second, someone. I apologize. I am actually going to have to shut Discord down because that's what just interrupted me and nearly gave me a heart attack. This is correct. There are no mice to help out. It's just the birds. That at least Disney kind of got right. No mice, but there are birds. In fact, there are only birds. I'm trying to think of anything else that immediately... I have not read any analysis of this. This is simply what occurred to me as I was reading. But while there are... I think I'll finish unless I... not finish for the whole thing. But I think I'll finish this particular story by observing that yes, there's some similarities with the Disney story, but this is much more localized, much more focused, obviously significantly darker at the end. And I will also end with a little personal story, because Cinderella and I have a slight association, because when I was 6-7 years old, I was actually in Cinderella, a play at the school I was in, and I played Buttons. Now you may think, who the heck is Buttons? There's no Buttons in the story. This is very true, but in the play there is, and I played Buttons. And I've got two memories from that. One, I was wearing tights that kept slipping down throughout the performance, and I kept having to yank them up to the great amusement of those watching. And two, I had a heck of a crush on the girl who played Cinderella, whose name was Angela Page, and I still remember her. Anyway, that is Cinderella. And that only took me 37 minutes. What I'm probably going to do is I'm obviously going to leave this live stream as it is, and I will probably record this separately so that we have a consistent narration without me stumbling over words. Right. Does anybody have any requests for what we might take a look at next? Because I've got plenty of time. And that was Cinderella. And as you can see, there are 200 fairy tales in Grimm's Fairy Tales. I will now see if I can find something else that might be suitable. I say might be suitable. None of them. I'm not sure about any of them being suitable. And some of them have different names. For example, it's not Little Red Riding Hood. I believe it is... Oh, I know. Let me see if I can find it. Where is Snow White? Little Redcap, by the way, is this is the story. This is Red Riding Hood. The Little Mermaid is not the Brothers Grimm. The Little Mermaid is Hans Christian Andersen. Hi, Taylor. So no. The Little Mermaid is not part of this collection. There is Hansel and Gretel. It's right here. That one's a little longer, I think. See if I can squeeze the whole thing on. I cannot. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, I can. Excuse me a second. I may just... Yeah, the minor problem with this is my video. Yeah, I'm going to have to disable... Oh no, what the heck. My original plan was actually to try and get everything on the screen at once, but I am probably going to have to get rid of the video for this, because otherwise you can't read it. Excuse me. So, are we interested in Hansel and Gretel? And I'll try. I am now curious as to whether I should actually pronounce the names as. I might try pronouncing the names, because that's not Hansel. That is German. And a umlaut has a different pronunciation. It would be Hansel. Hansel and Gretel. I'm going to call them Hansel and Gretel rather than try doing my German accent, because I'm not sure I could do that throughout the whole thing. Hansel and Gretel. All right. And if anybody gets nightmares, don't blame me. Hang on a second. There is just one thing I want to check. Yes, it is the version I'm after. There is one specific thing I wanted to check in the story to make sure it was the darker version. Because strangely, I think that even in Grimm's fairy tales, there are different versions. I'm pretty certain I've got somewhere a version of Cinderella where the stepsisters don't have their eyes pecked out. And this, of course, has a famous scene which is also portrayed in two different fashions and still comes under the title Hansel and Gretel. Alright, let me just clear my throat and drink some water. And I should further add, if any of you have children who are listening to this, don't blame me if they have nightmares. This, then, is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Hard by a great forest dwelt a poor woodcutter with his wife and his 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the little girl Gretel. He had little to bite and to break, and once when great dearth fell on the land, he could no longer procure even daily bread. Now when he thought over this by night in his bed, and tossed about in his anxiety, he groaned and said to his wife, "What is to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children when we no longer have anything even for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we will take the children out into the forest to where it is the thickest. There we will light a fire for them, and give each of them 1 more piece of bread, and then we will go to our work and leave them there alone. They will not find the way home again, and we shall be rid of them." "No, wife," said the man, "I will not do that. How can I bear to leave my children alone in the forest? The wild animals would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, you fool," said she, "then we must all 4 die of hunger, and you may as well plane the planks for our coffins." And she left him no peace until he consented. "But I feel very sorry for the poor children all the same," said the man. The 2 children had also not been able to sleep for hunger, and had heard what their stepmother had said to their father. Gretel wept bitter tears, and said to Hansel, "Now all is over with us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Do not distress yourself. I will soon find a way to help us." And when the old folks had fallen asleep, he got up, put on his little coat, opened the door below, and crept outside. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like real silver pennies. Hansel stooped and stuffed the little pocket of his coat with as many as he could get in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep in peace. God will not forsake us." And he lay down again in his bed. When day dawned, but before the sun had risen, the woman came and awoke the two children, saying, "Get up, you sluggards, we are going into the forest to fetch wood." She gave each a little piece of bread, and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it up before then, for you will get nothing else." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the pebbles in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and did so again and again. His father said, "Hansel, what are you looking at there, and staying behind for? Pay attention, and do not forget how to use your legs." "Ah, father," said Hansel, "I am looking at my little white cat, which is sitting up on the roof, and wants to say good-bye to me." The wife said, "Fool, that is not your little cat, that is the morning sun which is shining on the chimneys." Hansel, however, had not been looking back at the cat, but had been constantly throwing one of the white pebble-stones out of his pocket on the road. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, pile up some wood, and I will light a fire, that you may not be cold." Hansel and Gretel gathered brushwood together, as high as a little hill. The brushwood was lighted, and when the flames were burning very high, the woman said, "Now, children, lay yourselves down by the fire and rest. We will go into the forest and cut some wood. When we have done, we will come back and fetch you away." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, each ate a little piece of bread. And as they heard the strokes of the wood-axe, they believed that their father was near. It was not the axe, however, but a branch which he had fastened to a withered tree, which the wind was blowing backwards and forwards. And, as they had been sitting such a long time, their eyes closed with fatigue, and they fell fast asleep. When at last they awoke, it was already dark night. Gretel began to cry, and said, "How are we to get out of the forest now?" But Hansel comforted her, and said, "Just wait a little, until the moon has risen, and then we will soon find the way." And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand, and followed the pebbles which shone like newly coined silver pieces, and showed them the way. They walked the whole night long, and by break of day came once more to their father's house. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it, and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, "You naughty children, why have you slept so long in the forest? We thought you were never coming back at all." The father, however, rejoiced, for it had cut him to the heart to leave them behind alone. Not long afterwards there was once more great dearth throughout the land, and the children heard their mother saying at night to their father, "Everything is eaten again. We have 1/2 loaf left, and that is the end. The children must go. We will take them further into the woods, so that they will not find their way out again. There is no other means of saving ourselves." The man's heart was heavy, and he thought, "It would be better for you to share the last mouthful with your children." The woman, however, would listen to nothing that he had to say, but scolded and reproached him. He who says A must say B likewise, and as he had yielded the first time, he had to do so a second time also. The children, however, were still awake, and had heard the conversation. When the old folks were asleep, Hansel again got up and wanted to go and pick up pebbles as he had done before, but the woman had locked the door, and Hansel could not get out. Nevertheless, he comforted his little sister and said, "Do not cry, Gretel. Go to sleep quietly. The good God will help us." Early in the morning came the woman, and took the children out of their beds. Their piece of bread was given to them, but it was still smaller than the time before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his in his pocket, and often stood still and threw a morsel on the ground. "Hansel, why do you stop and look around?" said the father. "Go on." "I am looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof and wants to say good-bye to me," answered Hansel. "Fool," said the woman, "that is not your little pigeon, that is the morning sun that is shining on the chimney." Hansel, however, little by little threw all the crumbs on the path. The children led the... Sorry. Let me start that again. Hang on a moment. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, where they had never been in their lives. I'm sorry, I'm going to start that over again. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, where they had never in their lives been before. Then a great fire was again made, and the mother said, "Just sit there, you children, and when you are tired you may sleep a little. We are going into the forest to cut wood, and in the evening when we are done we will come and fetch you away." When it was noon, Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel, who had scattered his by the way. Then they fell asleep, and evening passed, but no one came to the poor children. They did not awake until it was dark night, and Hansel comforted his little sister and said, "Just wait, Gretel, until the moon rises, and then we shall see the crumbs of bread which I have strewn about, and they will show us our way home again." When the moon came, they set out, but they found no crumbs, for the many thousands of birds which fly about in the woods and fields had picked them up. Hansel said to Gretel, "We shall soon find the way," but they did not find it. They walked the whole night, and all the next day too, from morning till evening. But they did not get out of the forest, and were very hungry, for they had nothing to eat but 2 or 3 berries which grew on the ground. And as they were so weary that their legs would carry them no further, they lay down beneath a tree and fell asleep. It was now 3 mornings since they had left their father's house. They began to walk again, but they always came deeper into the forest, and if help did not come soon, they must die of hunger and weariness. When it was midday, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a bough, which sang so beautifully that they stood still and listened to it. And when its song was over, it spread its wings and flew away before them, and they followed it until they reached a little house, on the roof of which it alighted. And when they approached the little house, they saw that it was built of bread and covered with cakes, but that the windows were of clear sugar. "We shall set to work on that," said Hansel, "and have a good meal. I will eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window. It will taste sweet." Hansel reached up above and broke off a little of the roof to try how it tasted, and Gretel leant against the window and nibbled at the panes. Then a soft voice cried from the parlour, "Nibble, nibble, gnaw. Who is nibbling at my little house?" The children answered, the wind, the heaven-born wind," and went on eating without disturbing themselves. Hansel, who liked the taste of the roof, tore down a great piece of it, and Gretel pushed out the whole of one round window pane, sat down and enjoyed herself with it. Suddenly the door opened, and a woman as old as the hills, who supported herself on crutches, came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terribly frightened that they let fall what they had in their hands. The old woman, however, nodded her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Do come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. Then good food was set before them, milk and pancakes, with sugar, apples and nuts. Afterwards, 2 pretty little beds were covered with clean white linen, and Hansel and Gretel lay down in them and thought they were in heaven. The old woman had only pretended to be so kind, for she was in reality a wicked witch who lay in wait for children, and had only built the little house of bread in order to entice them there. When a child fell into her power, she killed it, cooked and ate it, and that was a feast day with her. Witches have red eyes and cannot see far, but they have a keen scent like the beasts, and are aware when human beings draw near. When Hansel and Gretel came into her neighbourhood, she laughed with malice and said mockingly, "I have them, they shall not escape me again." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she was already up, and when she saw both of them sleeping and looking so pretty with their plump and rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That will be a dainty mouthful." Then she seized Hansel with her shriveled hand, carried him into a little stable, and locked him in a grated door. Scream as he might, it would not help him. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, lazy thing, fetch some water and cook something good for your brother. He is in the stable outside, and he is made to be fat. When he is fat, I will eat him." Gretel began to weep bitterly, but all was in vain, for she was forced to do what the wicked witch commanded. And now the best foot, that's appropriate, and now the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the woman crept to the little stable and cried, "Hansel, stretch out your finger that I may feel if you will soon be fat." Hansel, however, stretched out a little bone to her, and the old woman, who had dim eyes, could not see it, and thought it was Hansel's finger, and was astonished that there was no way of fattening him. When 4 weeks had gone by, and Hansel still remained thin, she was seized with impatience, and would not wait any longer. "Now then, Gretel," she cried to the girl, "stir yourself and bring some water. Let Hansel be fat or lean. Tomorrow I will kill him and cook him." Ah, how the poor little sister did lament when she had to fetch the water, and how her tears did flow down her cheeks. "Dear God, do help us," she cried. "If the wild beasts in the forest had but devoured us, we should at any rate have died together." "Just keep your noise to yourself," said the old woman. "It won't help you at all." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the cauldron with the water and light the fire. "We will bake first," said the old woman. "I have already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel out to the oven, from which flames of fire were already darting. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it is properly heated so that we can put the bread in." And once Gretel was inside, she intended to shut the oven and let her bake in it, and then she would eat her too. But Gretel saw what she had in mind, and said, "I do not know how I am to do it. How do I get in?" "Silly goose," said the old woman, "the door is big enough. Just look, I can get in myself." And she crept up and thrust her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a push that drove her far up into it, and shut the iron door and fastened the bolt. Oh, then she began to howl quite horribly, But Gretel ran away, and the godless witch was miserably burned to death. Gretel, however, ran like lightning to Hansel, opened his little stable, and cried, "Hansel, we are saved! The old witch is dead!" Then Hansel sprang like a bird from its cage when the door is opened. How they did rejoice and embrace each other, and dance about and kiss each other. And then, as they had no longer any need to fear her, they went into the witch's house, and in every corner there stood chests full of pearls and jewels. "These are far better than pebbles," said Hansel, and thrust into his pockets whatever could be got in. And Gretel said, "I too will take something home with me," and filled her pinafore full. "But now we must be off," said Hansel, "that we may get out of the witch's forest." When they had walked for 2 days, they came to a great stretch of water. "We cannot cross," said Hansel. "I see no foot-plank and no bridge." "And there is also no ferry," answered Gretel, "but a white duck is swimming there. If I ask her, she will help us over." Then she cried, little duck, dost thou see? Hansel and Gretel are waiting for thee. There's never a plank or bridge in sight. Take us across on thy back so white." The duck came to them, and Hansel seated himself on its back, and told his sister to sit by him. "No," replied Gretel, "that will be too heavy for the little duck. She shall take us across one after the other." The good little duck did so, and when they were once safely across, and had walked for a short time, the forest seemed to be more and more familiar to them, and at length they saw from afar their father's house. Then they began to run, rushed into the parlour, and threw themselves around their father's neck. The man had not known one happy hour since he had left the children in the forest. The woman, however, was dead. Gretel emptied her pinafore until pearls and precious stones ran about the room, and Hansel threw one handful after another out of his pocket to add to them. Then all anxiety was at an end, and they all lived together in perfect happiness. My tale is done. There runs a mouse. Whosoever catches it may make himself a big fur cap out of it. Right, you're going to have to excuse me, and then when I come back, we can chat about this a little, because it is, I find, quite a fascinating story. Not necessarily for the content, which is fairly conventional, but there are some hidden bits which I think worth pointing out. So give me 3 or 4 minutes while I attend to a 59-year-old bladder, and I will be right back. And drat, I just realised I left the video on this entire time. Drat, never mind. Anyway, I'll see you all in a couple of minutes. And I am back. Um, no, that's actually a good point. One weird error. It's not that different from the standard story. As far as I can remember, Disney never made a cartoon out of this. I think I have seen a cartoon version of it, which would have been made, I think, 1940s, 1950s. But I don't remember all the details. The normal story is pretty much follows, of course, the basic plot, but there are some things in here. I mean, first of all, we normally associate the witch's house. Typically, it's a gingerbread house that is, in my mind, it isn't. It's made of bread with cakes on it. Which I must admit, the longevity in a forest of such a construction would need refreshing on a regular basis, but it's a fairy tale, so I don't get to poke too much at that. But it is obviously an extremely dark story. There's no way around it. It's extremely dark. But it does possibly have some reflection of a certain grim reality. And I'm trying to remember whether I read, watched, on what it was, but the idea that they basically were going through periods of famine is certainly quite possible. And in periods of severe famine, people have done some very dire things, up to and including cannibalism, in order to survive. And it is very tempting to think they're in this great forest. The man's a woodcutter. The forest is full of animals, but nobody thinks to go hunt the animals. Now, there is, and I don't know how it was in Europe, but there was in Great Britain, and I can't remember up until what point, where the common folk, the peasantry, people like this woodcutter, to hunt animals in the forest was considered, as I remember correctly, treason, because the forest essentially belonged to the king or to the nobility. And I don't know what effect that has. If you have generations of people who are constantly unable to go hunting, although obviously there's probably going to be some, I won't say leeway, that might have a very, I don't know what effect that would have on the psychology of the people. They're starving to death, but they know that they can't go hunting in the forests. Obviously there were poachers. I think if they were caught, the first time they would lose a hand, and if they were caught a second time, they would lose the other hand. Which, I mean, losing a hand the first time is pretty much a death sentence. Losing your hand the second time, the other hand, would basically have been a death sentence, even if you survived traumatic amputation. That I think may be these periods of famine is possibly the origins of this story. Don't know where the witch comes from. However, again, in reality, I mean, the idea of the hedge witch, the woman who lived in the woods, has a fairly solid place in Western folklore, and I'm not sure about reality. And it was such women that were sometimes a victim of things like the Inquisition during the burning times. Those women, of course, were not necessarily witches. There's no such thing as witches. But they were a convenient victims for the period. And it does make me wonder, and I will probably have to look it up at some point, what the origins of this story was. The origins of the witch hunting themselves are kind of interesting and stem out of the rise of Protestantism, if you can believe that. Starting in Grief, want to say late 14th, early 15th century, there began to be a move away from Catholicism. Now, the interesting thing about Catholicism is that good Catholics, in principle, did not believe in witches and werewolves, and I'll come back to werewolves in a minute. Did not believe. It was actually heresy to believe in the supernatural, and this had been laid out as long ago as the 700s, 800s. There's actually a Vatican decree, I think, dating back to that, which basically states, believe in the supernatural was, considered heresy. However, Protestants did believe in witches and the supernatural, and it is actually arguably they who started the witch burnings. Now, the witch burnings are not generally considered to be... Yes, it was a terrible period, but it was not quite as terrible as is sometimes thought. But it still was not a great thing. But essentially, the Catholics, seeing that the Protestants were gaining, shall we say, a following, partially based on the fact that, now we get to believe in the supernatural without being considered heretics, kind of relaxed their policy on witches. And that's arguably where the burning times originated, this political conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. And in fact, something like 200 years later, in the early 17th century, I think it was King James the First, King James the Sixth of Scotland, King James the First of England, wrote Malleus Maleficorum, the hammer of the evildoers, because he believed in witches. I think he was Catholic. No, was he Catholic? I can't remember whether King James I was Catholic. Or was he Lutheran? Anyway, so the idea of a belief in witches had been sort of solidly re-established by that point. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression there. But the interesting part to me, the whole thing is kind of interesting. But the part that was completely unexpected when I reviewed this a few days ago, first of all, was the sudden and rather unexpected appearance of the duck. I mean, that's a little... Where does that come from? I mean, I was completely not expecting a duck to pop into the story. And the second thing that struck popped out, well, more than one thing. The next thing that popped out for me was the end here. All anxiety was at an end, and they lived together in perfect happiness. There's your happily ever after. What's this? My tale is done, there runs a mouse, whosoever catches it may make himself a big fur cap out of it. I have absolutely no idea where that comes from, and that must be a really big mouse, because, unless they had, unless it was a beaver or something, You're not going to get a great big fur cap out of a little mouse. And of course, the other part of it, which again I think comes out of times of famine in the medieval period, is this conflict, if you like, between the husband and his wife. There is, I think, some speculation, or a version of this where the woman was not the children's natural mother, but that she was in fact their stepmother. But I can't remember if that's a possible interpretation or well, yes, it's not just it was, like I say, it wasn't just the Protestants, the Catholics as well. Yeah. And of course, that particular conflict led to a period which, and again, I am speculating because my brain is sort of tickling. There's the possibility that this kind of story arose during the 30 Years' War, which was a particularly horrific conflict in the early 17th century. And I think that killed millions of people, most of whom were not actually soldiers. They were the common people. In fact, there's huge areas of Europe that were basically ravaged back and forth by different armies of the period. You can still see the signs of it if you are familiar with walled towns. Part of the reason they are is because of the 30 Years' War. But I'm not aware of an earlier version of this. Oh, the other thing about the witch in the woods. This is kind of interesting. There were at the same time as the witch burnings, there were werewolf trials. And I wish I had known I was going to go into this, because I'd dig out the book I've got on it and refresh my memory. And I remember one particular case, and I wish I could remember all the details, but the werewolf in question was a man living in the woods. And he was captured and tortured and forced to confess. So I'm wondering if there's a link between the idea of a woman who eats children and a werewolf, otherwise known as a serial killer. That, and if any children, if I was monetized, I'd probably just demonetize myself. But some of the werewolf trials, according to those who have studied them, say that the pathology of the men in question is remarkably similar to that of what we'd later come to associate with serial killers. And again, you've got this werewolf living in the middle of the woods away from everybody doing horrific things. And so I'm tempted to wonder if there is some link between the wicked witch here. I mean, this isn't a witch in the, say, conventional sense, unless part of this is also a propaganda piece to encourage the idea that women living alone simply cannot be trusted, especially if they own cats. But I'm not sure about that last part. But there is a lot hidden away in this story. There's probably a lot hidden away in the Cinderella story that I am simply missing. This one, for some reason, my brain is teasing me with thoughts, and I can't remember where on earth I got them from. But of course, the weird thing is this again, and there is this odd. Never mind the ending being odd with the mouse running around. It's the idea that they went back to their father. Now I suppose you could say, well, where else would they go? But, as far as the children are concerned, the father is as complicit as his wife. I mean, it's weird. I mean, yes, okay, you could have had the man under the dominion of the wife, but it's weird that they go back, all is forgiven, they live happily ever after. I mean, surely a more reasonable response to that is, why did you try to kill us, father? But apparently they just give him all their treasure, and that's the end of the story. They all live happily ever after. That's somewhat disjointed to me, but that possibly is because, we're living in the 21st century and our attitude towards such things may be different. It is just strange. I know it's a fairy tale, but there are some human responses that you would kind of expect from this, and we're not seeing them. Yeah, but he still did it. He wasn't that dead set against it. I mean, if he had, for example, killed the woman instead, that would be more understandable, I suppose, than what occurred. There is also another aspect to it, and that is worth considering. Throughout the medieval period until surprisingly recently, children died young all the time. I think I remember that in some places you were not considered a proper mother until you'd had a child die on you. So you could argue that this complicit husband here, they could have had more children, you see, which is a dire thing to think of, but this is actually what happened. They might lose 3 or 4 children and have 1 or 2 survive to adulthood. That wasn't uncommon either. And maybe we're seeing a reflection of that in the story as well, this acceptance that children are going to die, we can have more. That's actually pretty much what happened. And you've got to bear in mind, this was a period, arguably, I don't know, this was written, 1813, the story is going to be older than that. But throughout most of human history, as I understand it, the biggest cause of death amongst women of childbearing age was in fact childbirth. The death rate amongst women giving birth was, we would regard it as horrendous. And so that's probably where the very dark and bleak nature of this comes from, is the, let's face it, downright traumatic circumstances under which many people lived at the time. I mean, disease was rampant. It's saying here disease was rampant, there were famines. If you had a bad harvest, and bad harvests happened surprisingly frequently, which means people are going to die over winter. So it may, you can then start to speculate, what would people do to survive through the winter? Your brain starts developing really quite disturbing thoughts when you think about that. What will people do in order to survive? History tells us they do quite dramatic things in order to survive. This is also, actually, do you remember what I said, that possibly the mother, the woman, notice she was only called the woman. This first sentence is interesting. Hard by a great forest dwelt a poor woodcutter with his wife and his 2 children. Not their 2 children, his 2 children. And I think that is where the possible interpretation that the woman was the children's stepmother comes from, because that's quite a interesting way of putting it. In this day and age, you might say, hard by a great forest dwelt a poor woodcutter with his wife and their 2 children. Doesn't say that, it says his 2 children, which might go to explain why she is quite so willing to take them out and kill them, albeit not directly. And I don't think I can squeeze much more out of this without actually going and doing full research. I really wasn't planning on reading Hansel and Gretel today, so... But in some respects, it is a much more interesting story than Cinderella, because there is I think there's a lot in there, other than just the story. Anyway, my voice is not really up to reading another one. I am inclined to bring this to a halt. If anybody has any other comments, now would be a good time to make them. I am very inclined to I don't think there's any way I can take this and edit it down to a good rendition of either story, so I am inclined, I think, at some point to re-record these and then re-upload them to the playlist. This will stay on, whatever happens, this is going to stay on my live stream playlist, and then if I rework it, I will upload it to their own playlist, the Grimm's Fairy Tales playlist. Now, depending... Oh, grief, my voice is really starting to go. As long as it's not your children looking at you speculatively. Now, like I said, this was something of an experiment. Between now and next Wednesday, depending on feedback, views, that kind of thing, I may well do the same again next Wednesday. Wednesday tends to be my literature day anyway. I uploaded a poem today, High Flight, which is I think it's a good poem. I think I did a halfway decent job on it. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will keep you all posted as to whether I repeat this experiment next week. Unfortunately, I'm really not up, I think I can feel it, to reading for 2 solid hours. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon. Normal service will resume tomorrow, Long Dark in the morning, and I'm not going to stream the Long Dark tomorrow. I will stream something else, much more relaxing. I'll probably stream Sky Children of the Light, if only because it's a break for me and it's quite relaxing. So anyway, have a good rest of the day, everybody, and I will see you all very soon.